Welcome back to The Heat as we continue our discussion on why some members of the US military have been prosecuted for crimes such as theft and bribery while serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. Richard Bistrong, I just want to go back to you because just before the break you said you had no moral qualms about being in a position where you committed fraud. But did you come to realise when you actually started going undercover for the FBI the importance of the consequences of corruption going forward? You hinted at that before the break.
Well, I certainly realized what those consequences were when I received a call from the Justice Department in 2007 saying that I was the target of a criminal investigation. So if we go back to 2007, Nathan, you probably didn't see, and I think James and Joe would probably agree with this, you weren't seeing a lot about the FCPA. The Bribery Act in the United Kingdom wasn't even a law at that time.
You mean the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, yeah.
Right. So there really wasn't a lot of enforcement at the time that I was traveling, but that's no justification or excuse, Nathan, because I knew what I was doing was illegal at the time that I did it. But was I indexing the consequences and the risk? From the places where I operated, I talk about a story from Tierra del Fuego, Argentina, the southernmost inhabitable city on earth, I believe, and talking about corruption with a third party. It's not like I was thinking I'm going to get caught or there are witnesses here, you know, I could get into trouble.
James,
so when people often, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just want James to widen it out because that's your personal experience, Richard. But what about the consequences of corruption on the society in which the military are operating as well, in Iraq and Afghanistan? That has real consequences, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. And the people on the ground realize that the corruption is going on. They see it, and it creates a friction between them and any intervening force, no matter how much goodwill there is in the intervening force to want to create peace. If the people catch on to these kind of things and rumors and even conspiracies perpetuated along the population, and there's the idea that going into some countries, or it used to be an idea, and it's starting to change bit by bit from lessons learned now, that, well, this is just the way that things are in these countries. People like corruption, and there's a difference between liking corruption and being used to a corrupt society. And even in Afghanistan, polls were coming out that for a lot of Afghani citizens, corruption is one of the #1 issues. So seeing any intervening force or any peace-building force come in and engage with corrupt officials for the sake of short-term stability even, it can create a gap for acknowledgement with the population about what the goals here are. And this is just one more force coming in, whether that be any force in the African Union and NATO, everyone faces the same risk for that.
And do you think also in the military, because there was lots of stories about the CIA, for example, giving bundles of cash for the surge in Iraq with tribes in Anbar province, we saw ministers in Afghanistan government going to Gulf states with bags of cash as well. That filters down as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, stories make their way across, and again, there's always this thing in a peace-building setting of the urgency of creating a stable environment and negotiating with basically kingmakers. And for a long time, it was still the mentality of, well, corruption is somewhere in the back. We've got to do stability now. And yet again, examples like that are now coming back into lessons and saying we've got to put corruption up front in our programming and peace-building operations. And those lessons are starting to make their way into doctrine, into training. So hopefully UN, African Union, other organizations will start using that training so that they can avoid some of these consequences.
But we're not there yet in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Joseph Smith, you've had some real personal experience of what corruption can cost in Iraq. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, in Iraq, 2 of my colleagues in the anti-corruption business were assassinated, literally because of our efforts together to fight corruption. And one was the head of the equivalent of the GAO in Baghdad, who was the legal owner of the oil for food documents that I had been asked by members of Congress to take custody of. Of course, as the Inspector General, I didn't want to take custody of somebody else's property without permission, so I asked the local IG in Baghdad to obtain permission, and he called me the next day and said, "Good and bad news, Joe. Found the guy who owns it, got permission, but he was just assassinated."
And you had another Iraqi woman who's...
Yes, my counterpart, the Inspector General for the Iraqi Minister of Defense, Layla al-Bakhtour, was assassinated just about as I was going over to help her put into place in the Ministry of Defense some anti-corruption training and checks and balances.
Richard Bistrong, do you think the global arms industry is unique in terms of the ability to foster corruption?
I don't think so, Nathan. I think where you have markets that are exemplified by weak state institutions, and you have multiple touch points of public officials who throughout the ministries are poorly trained, poorly compensated, I really do see that regardless of the industry, whether it's pharmaceuticals, oil and gas,
or football,
defense and aerospace, the possibilities exist.
What can be done, though, because the arms trade generally in the military seems to be a little more opaque than other civilian industries. It doesn't have the same scrutiny. I'm sure you wish it did, but it doesn't, right, Richard?
Well, it depends. There are, and I think Joe would chime in on this, it depends on which side. For example, in the United States, arms exports are highly governed by the Department of Commerce and the Department of State. So the transparency depends on, I think, the country that's receiving the goods and the country that's exporting the goods.
Joseph Schmitz, has any of this money been recovered?
Oh, yeah. A lot of the money that is investigated, and when people are convicted, there's restitution and there's recovery of some of the funds. I'm not saying I can't quantify it right now, but there are built-in incentives for the people investigating to actually recover the funds and get it back to the American taxpayers.
The Cost of War Index by the Brookings Institution is a fascinating document. It says that $75 billion was paid out during the Iraq war to subcontracting companies. Lots of money also paid out to the army, and some of it went missing. In fact, the US ended up owing Iraq money because of fraud before it left. $7 billion. They're not going to recover that amount of money, are they?
No. Unfortunately, it's unfortunate too. And a lot of the waste, frankly, is not necessarily in crimes. A lot of the waste is simply in the way that we had put together our tiered contracting, where the American taxpayers were simply not getting a good bargain.
There was one figure I wanted to quote you, $3 billion in one payment to one company. The Pentagon auditors considered questionable. This was like almost half the budget that they were given. So it encourages wastefulness, which is, in a way, also encourages lax accounting, all these sort of things, right? I mean,
that's right. And and sometimes there are exigencies where you just don't have the luxury of having full and fair competition. But there are a lot of instances where there's just a lot of fat that needs to be trimmed.
James Cohen, lessons learned from Iraq, Afghanistan, way forward?
I think that basically corruption needs to be recognized as part of the problem in destabilization in these environments. So the military to protect themselves through safeguarding oversight, through training, so that they aren't doing harm, that they're not part of the problem, and that they recognize that they have to build up anti-corruption programming in their reconstruction and stabilization efforts.
Richard Bistrong, last word. What's your advice to people tempted by this sort of fraud? Don't do it?
Well, what I share at corporate events is they should call home if they feel pressured to break the law. And I say, don't call your compliance officer, call your loved ones, call your family, because there's no risk that's worth your own liberty.
Is that a reality check? You feel that sometimes people are divorced by reality, from reality?
I think that's right. I think operating in environments where you're jet lagged, where you're feeling pressure to succeed, that speaking to a child, a spouse, a friend, that's a very, very sobering reality check, Nathan.